You're listening to Skate of Thrones, your go-to podcast for dialed-in LA Kings coverage.
Welcome back to Skate of Thrones, the podcast that dials in on the Los Angeles Kings. I'm your host, Casey Kasliner, as here on Saturday night, the Kings and the Stars had an absolutely incredible game. This game had a little bit of everything, but the Kings come out ahead in the shootout. Final score 5-4. Stars and Kings, it's always competitive. Obviously, last season, the Kings struggled very severely against the Stars. A couple of 4-1 losses, a 5-1 loss in there. And it's been like that for some years. You know, the Stars are obviously such a deep team, but the Kings now with 2 wins over Dallas here in this season, winning 5-4. And like I said, this game had everything. It had a goal 11 seconds in from Warren Foegele. That was his 14th of the year. And that really set the tone early for the Kings. They had a lot of early momentum going, a lot of chances from Kevin Fiala, Foegele himself, Trevor Moore, and that was Foegele's second straight game with a goal. So definitely an interesting start for the Kings. But at the end of the period, really with only 2 seconds left, Matt Duchene ties up the game and then immediately leads to a fight. And I think that really inserted some energy and some juice into the Kings, as they would not necessarily let up. I mean, this game was really back and forth. The Kings only trailed at one point in this game. The Kings were not great to start the second period. Things got a little bit slower. It felt a lot more even. Dallas was getting their chances, had some good looks. But Kevin Fiala, really the guy who has completely turned his season around, gives the Kings the lead again. And I'll talk in a little bit about what happened with Fiala toward the end of this game. Obviously, he'd be robbed of a goal because of goalie interference that would have won the game. But Fiala, with 2 points in each of the last 3 games, Kings now on a 3-game winning streak following a 4-game losing streak. So really, the formula is Kevin Fiala plays well. It's a good day for the Kings. And their lineup looked the same as the last game, a win over Montreal on Wednesday. No changes, obviously back to the 12 forward, 6 defenseman look with Mikey Anderson injured and confirmed he will not play tomorrow against Anaheim, as Jim Hiller noted that in the press conference. But definitely a good turning point in Fiala's season. In the press conference, Jim Hiller praised him a lot, saying, of course, his first half was rough. And you know, Kings fans and the media knows that Kevin Fiala, and Jim Hiller had sort of an interesting dynamic, as Fiala's, of course, an established veteran, but he'd been benched a few times in games. And now, of course, he's turned it around and is looking like a surefire player the Kings want to look to down the stretch as the season continues. So he had LA's second goal of the game, but this game was truly back and forth. Thomas Harley scores a minute later, and a tough look for David Riddick in net. Riddick struggled tonight with rebound looks. The Stars were able to push it through a lot and create a lot of chances off the rebound. And you expect that from a team that's really stacked and really deep top to bottom, being able to create chances and not necessarily take the best shot on a first look, but get those good rebounds. However, Alex Laferriere, another player who has stepped up for the Kings on that third line, gets them the lead off a beautiful play as Quinton Byfield gets the primary assist. He launched a shot toward the net, and Laferriere placed himself in a perfect position. Fiala with an assist there, so that was his second point of the game. But in the third period, 2 goals from the Stars, and it seemed to shake up the Kings a little bit. And the Kings leading up to that really didn't have much to go in the latter half of the second period. The Stars were forechecking the Kings severely, and the Kings were struggling with that, defending that vicious forecheck that was just so punishing in the zone. And of course, on a guy like Riddick, he showed flashes this year, but having to undergo a lot of that pressure was very, very tough. Dallas ended up launching 30 shots. Kings had 37, so they get that edge. And the Kings, I want to add before we continue, the highest scoring team in February right now, whereas they were the lowest scoring team in January. So maybe it was just a turn of the calendar they needed. But 14 total goals for the Kings in February, plus the shootout tonight, technically 15. So just some interesting notes, as, of course, in January, the Kings were borderline hard to watch. Of course, carrying a losing streak into February is always tough, but they've rebounded, and you have to give it to them. Kevin Fiala now with 13 points since the turn of the year, now in 2025. So certainly a turning point for the Kings. But in the third period, the Kings blew a lot of chances. Adrian Kempe appeared frustrated, blowing some chances, having looks on seemingly wide open goals, and Ottinger really struggled to stay in position a few times, and Kempe just could not capitalize on it. And Bourque and Duchene score on the Kings, and so, just like that, Dallas has the lead for the first time in this game. And so, heading into the waning moments of the third period, the Kings have to respond. Anze Kopitar puts himself in the right spot in the crease, capitalizing on a beautiful sequence spearheaded by Trevor Moore and Adrian Kempe. And that first line really needed that. Of course, everyone's been talking about the Kings' third line and what it's been able to do lately. But of course, that first line with, the headlining names, Anze Kopitar, and what he's been able to do this year, he's such a great player, but hadn't scored a goal in quite some time. Didn't have a goal in the month of January when the Kings struggled. Only had 4 assists. His last goal was December 29th against Philly when the Kings had 5 goals in that game. So a very good look for Anze Kopitar. Just a beautiful sequence. It was, all 3 forwards were streaking up the ice, and that's going to do it to you. So it's tied at the end of regulation. We go to overtime. Kevin Fiala ends up scoring in the waning moments, but the goal is overturned for goalie interference. And so Fiala had a chance there to have 3 points and another 2-goal performance, which would have been his third in the last 3 games. But the Kings end up getting the job done in the shootout. David Riddick does his job. Props to him. Adrian Kempe and Fiala scoring. And so the Kings get a much-needed win, now 3 in a row. Now 17-3-1 at home. It's inexplicable how they've been able to do this at home. And another crazy stat is the Kings are 11-1-1 at home versus current playoff teams, meaning that even when they're playing some of these really top-tier teams, they're able to secure wins. It's not a fluke at home. They're a truly good team at home. It's just they struggle on the road. And we've seen that with the Kings in previous years, as being really good either at home or away and not having consistent success during both. I want to acknowledge the first line really gathering steam, kind of feeding off that third line. Alex Laferriere talked about it in the press conference. He's playing with really skilled guys in Quinton Byfield and Kevin Fiala. And really, when those guys get looks, it motivates the rest of the team. Jim Hiller praised Tanner Jeannot, not only amping up the team at the end of the first period, but also laying down some clean hits early on that really kind of juiced the team up. Obviously, he's a lower line guy, and the Kings' fourth line has struggled a lot this year, but Jeannot really laid his physical edge. Another interesting note is Drew Doughty had 29 minutes on the ice. Jim Hiller thought he looked comfortable tonight, and of course, I personally didn't think that Doughty had his best game. Jim Hiller thought it was one of his better games. I think Doughty's still getting comfortable. It's obviously a big point for him coming back in the season, just debuting in this year the other night. So without Mikey Anderson, they're going to rely a lot more, obviously using 6 defensemen now again. So that was interesting. Another interesting thing is Brandt Clarke sat out for the last 9 minutes of regulation. And we know what's been going on with him in the wake of Drew Doughty returning, but just something interesting to think about, as of course the Kings just seem like they don't really like and trust Brandt Clarke's defensive game. And so that's something to think about. Obviously we'll keep tabs on if that changes, but as for right now, plenty of upside earlier in the season, just hasn't received the playing time that we saw him get earlier in the year. He'd have upwards of 20 minutes of playing time earlier in the year. Tonight, of course, only under 14 minutes, had 14 and a half against Montreal. So it's really changed, and obviously he's young. He's a 21-year-old guy, but he was creating a lot of offense for the Kings. It's just they don't seem to like his game, and that's notable considering the Kings are back in their winning ways the past week, but of course it looks a little bit different with Doughty back in the lineup. Jim Hiller won his 50th game as the Kings head coach tonight, obviously taking over for Todd McClellan, who was fired last year. Hiller was the fastest head coach in Kings history to reach the 50-win mark in just 86 games. So very impressive. He's really done a lot for this team. For how successful they've been this year, by and large, it's been really impressive to see what Hiller's been able to accomplish with this roster. But I thought the Kings played really well off the rush tonight. They had some good looks in transition. I think their biggest challenge was playing off the forecheck of Dallas. But for the Kings, scoring 11 seconds in, creating that momentum early on, I don't know if they win this game if they don't get juiced up early. Of course, it was a back and forth game, and, they very well could have lost this game. Fiala's goal gets taken away in overtime, and they've had some gritty wins lately. Of course, they've been successful, and they'll have a back-to-back tomorrow night playing against the Anaheim Ducks at home, who have been a little bit hot lately, and so that'll be an interesting thing to look forward to, the freeway face-off. But I think for the Kings, they're ultimately going to want to stay consistent through all 3 periods. It's really hard to play a complete game, especially when you're shorthanded. Mikey Anderson's hurt. It feels like whenever someone comes back, someone else is hurt. However, the Kings have shown this year that, they're usually a very one or the other team. Start out slow, finish strong, or like tonight, start off well like they did tonight, and then finish off slowly. Luckily tonight, obviously, they finished off strong with Kopitar getting that final goal in regulation, and they nearly won it in overtime. Did their job in the shootout. And I will say as well, I think Adrian Kempe scoring in the shootout was big. He looked frustrated, like I mentioned. Also had a lackluster boarding penalty. Luckily, it wasn't costly for the Kings, as it would turn into a 4-on-4 chance that didn't lead to any goals. But the Kings are changing. They look a lot different. Highest scoring team in February so far. The Kings have 4 games left on the homestand, hosting Anaheim, Utah, Vegas, and Vancouver. those Vegas and Vancouver games are going to be really important. Obviously, the Kings tonight created some really nice separation on the Canucks, but LA is just 6 points back of the Knights with 3 less games played. And so some critical ground in store. Of course, this division right now is the Wild Pacific, with Calgary just 5 points back of LA in 5th place, Vancouver 3 points back of the Kings in 4th, and the Kings not too far out of a potential 2nd place. Probably would like to avoid playing Edmonton in the playoffs again, but plenty of season left, and so we'll see what happens. But if I had to summarize this game, it was probably LA's most gritty, hard-fought win of the year in the shootout. The Kings have had some overtime games recently in the past couple of months. They've only had one shootout game though, and that was the loss to Chicago way back earlier in the season. And so good for them to push this one to the shootout, get the win, especially against a guy like Jake Ottinger, who's such a talented young goalie. But they have Darcy Kemper available tomorrow. He was celebrating the birth of his 2nd child, so he should be back in theory. And the Kings will have a game against Anaheim that they shouldn't take too lightly. Like I said, Anaheim's been playing well lately. But for LA, an absolutely great win, and I can't overstate it. This team is so resilient at home. They play just so well in front of the home fans. They also find ways to squeak out wins in games that maybe they're not necessarily deserving of winning earlier in the game. And we saw in this one, they trailed in the 3rd period. They really tightened up their passing late. It looked like stuff was going south maybe later on, especially at the beginning of overtime, but they found a way to win, and that's what's important. And they've done that all year at home. My last thing is I wanted to mention the defense tonight. I didn't have any notes that it was particularly sound. Of course, you allow 4 goals, but of course, Dallas is a great scoring team. I want to see Doughty get adjusted more. You really can't fault the guy yet. Of course, he's, just adjusting after missing so much of the season, and he's up there in age as well. It's hard to come back from an injury at that rate. But it was good to see Vladislav Gavrikov create some offense for the Kings. Just go out there and be resilient, play a full game. Of course, like we mentioned, Drew Doughty played 29 minutes, almost 30. The younger guys, Clark, Muvarari, and Spence, taking a little bit less time, but the vets were up there and creating chances, and that was that. So that's just gonna about do it. This was Skate of Thrones. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll have coverage tomorrow. Don't forget to tune in then. As always, I'm Casey Kasliner, your host. Kings win 5-4 in the shootout over Dallas. Have a good one, and thank you for listening.